All right, it looks like we've slowed down here a little bit on the participants coming in, so we can get started if you want, Paul.
Cool.
My name's Pat Shepard. I'm going to act as the host of this session, which really just means I'm going to be the guy keeping the wheels on the bus here in the background, and then I'll circle back after the presentations are over, and I'll moderate the Q&A. But I'm going to quickly hand things over to Paul Anderson, the executive director at here at Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, and thanks for joining us today. You'll hear my voice a little bit later.
Thank you, Pat. Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, my name is Paul Anderson. I'm the executive director at the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, coming to you from my home in Winterport. Thank you, Pat, for your support helping with that. After I introduce the panelists, we're going to do a series of short presentations, and if we do this right, we're going to allow a good 15 minutes or so of interaction and chat from all of you using either the question and answer button or the chat button, and Pat will help moderate us through that. So again, thanks for joining us I want to welcome our two panelists. John, want to introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, my name's John Hare, and I'm the director of the Northeast Fishery Science Center, and I'm speaking to you from Falmouth, Massachusetts.
Thanks, John. Carl?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carl Wilson. I'm with the Maine Department of Marine Resources, where I head up our Bureau of Marine Sciences, and speaking from my Halloween decorated home in Alna.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks both, and I really appreciate the two of you in particular joining us today. I've known Carl since he was a graduate student. I've really enjoyed getting to know him more through this initiative that we're going to talk about today, and also getting to meet John. And really, I think what has become a really neat collaboration between both state and federal research interests, policy interests, as well as what we're doing at the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries. And so I'm going to share my screen and queue up my presentation. Everybody see that okay, I hope. I want to thank Dr. Carla Gunther, first of all, and send her regrets that she can't be here, although for very good reason, and congratulations to Carla and her husband Dominic on the arrival of a beautiful little big baby girl just about a week and a half ago. Otherwise, Carla would certainly be here helping to talk about this, and she helped to prepare the stuff that I'll be sharing with you here today. And she'll be back with us at the end of the year, early in next year after maternity leave. So today the topic is ecosystem-based fisheries management, and there's a lot of different ways to cut that, and no doubt most of you are familiar with the terminology and perhaps working on these kinds of issues in your own place and in your own space and in your own ways. And what we want to describe to you today is perhaps a different approach. And the combination of these three entities that are talking to you have formed this coalition, this collaborative, and we've named it the Eastern Maine Coastal Current Collaborative. Okay, just real quick, the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries is in Stonington, Maine, right, located right over here in Hancock County. That's our building right on the water. And we're a small nonprofit organization doing great big things. A staff of about 10. Our work tends to fit into these three circles right now, and our new strategic plan really codifies our work in this way, where we work on collaborative research. You just met Pat Shepard. He manages several different projects related to working with fishermen and communities on collaborative research. Collaborative management is run by Mike Talhauser, who's our collaborative management specialist, and some projects that are listed here that fit into that circle. And collaborative education, Tom Dime helps to manage those programs for us, and that's both formal education through the Eastern Maine Skippers program that you may know about, as well as our on-site Discovery Wharf and other things that we do that are more about free choice learning. We see these three things aggregating together and really helping to achieve the mission that we have of helping to sustain commercial fisheries and the communities that depend on them. So what we're going to tell you about today is this Eastern Maine Coastal Current Collaborative that was initiated by my predecessor. Robin Alden was a real visionary and helped to found the center And as she was nearing retirement, she had helped to begin navigating and negotiating a relationship between NOAA Fisheries and the Science Center and DMR and us around a notion that we could look at Eastern Maine as a unique place. And sure enough, it turns out the oceanography of it defines this place. So we created this collaborative through a cooperative research and development agreement that is a formal instrument of the federal government for bringing non-governmental entities to the table. And so we are working under a 5-year CRADA for this project. And what was really neat around, if anybody knows about the ecosystem-based fisheries management approach, you really got to have a place to do this stuff, and you've got to define some boundaries. And so the coastal current is defined long ago by Drs. David Brooks from Texas and David Townsend from here in Maine. Some of the work they had done in biological oceanography, linking up with some physical oceanography, really kind of proved that we have a body of water in Eastern Maine that's fed through the various forces that come into the Gulf of Maine and the Bay of Fundy that hugs the shore along Hancock, Washington counties, and then gyres out. And very little of this water in this part of Maine ends up in the Western Gulf. So these are two sort of sub-units in the Gulf of Maine that gives us the place. And I remember talking to Carl, who you'll hear from in a moment, about, well, how do we measure this inland and out on the water? And so we wanted to constrain this to kind of a thinking space where we could define audiences, stakeholders, and interests in a kind of place-based way. So that gives us this sort of range. And this map here shows you how we've sort of integrated the sub-watersheds in Hancock and Washington County to kind of create our scope, our geographic scope. So our objective is to develop a research framework over these 5 years that will support ecosystem-based fisheries management in this region. EBFM has lots of different definitions. This is from a publication of NOAA's from years ago. I'm going to try not to bury you with too many words here, but the important ones I think here are that we have a geographically specified area and we can contribute to the resilience and sustainability of the ecosystem, but recognizing that we have to take into account physical, biological, economic, and social interactions. So much of what I'm going to share with you here to start this conversation is really about how we at Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries have one foot in the natural sciences, but we're also paying closely attention to the social economic factors that really are important to the long-term prosperity and sustainability of these communities. Carla put this together and from a paper by Levin et al. From 2018, and really just kind of describes the process that we're in around formulating those research objectives. Essentially, we're in 2020 here. We're kind of in this meet up and figure out where we're going with this. Eventually, how do we get there? We start developing and defining some measures and needs and develop a work plan that becomes sort of a research agenda to fill in gaps. And so this will be a cyclical process, and we hope it becomes a way of life. This isn't just an event. This is kind of maybe a new way of thinking about how we think together and how we identify and define problems and define solutions together that bump into and cross over between natural and social systems. We started our process in 2019, and I suspect a lot of you were at this conference, a 2-day conference up at the University of Maine in Machias. On the left, you can see the names of the folks that we included in our keynote presentations and a plenary. But over the 2 days, we also did some breakout groups and had some really rich dialogue around several themes. And you can see on the right some of the folks that have come to the table and either participated in planning or have helped to support what we're doing with that. That conference, we took kind of this approach where we looked at the ecosystem in 4 habitat segments, so to speak, and we looking to the upland, kind of that 40 miles up thing, and then along the coast and the intertide, and then the near shore, maybe out to 3 miles, and then further offshore. And so we broke out in those breakout groups and thinking about those kinds of places, those kinds of segments of the overall habitat. And beginning to have a dialogue and get people's thoughts about what are the strains and risks and opportunities and challenges that we face in terms of managing our fisheries for long-term sustainability and helping those communities. From that, we leapt into what we were pretty enthused about, a 2020 phase 2 engagement with our staff at MCCF and planned a series of watershed level meetings where rather than looking at the whole region, we recognized that there would be very place-based interests and motivators and probably knowledge that we wanted to get our hands around and begin to have this conversation in a more localized way. So we chose 4 sub-watersheds that are listed here and indicated on the map with the blue dots. And we began this process in January. And initially, it would be 1 round of these meetings, getting local voices into the room. And I'll show you a little bit about how that went. And then the intent was to come back around and begin to bring in a more inclusive audience of relevant expertise, trying to enrich the conversation around some of those themes and concerns that emerged in the community conversations. Well, COVID happened. It's been a bit of a speed bump, and for all of you and for all of us. So consequently, we did not get to Pleasant River, Machias Bay on this level, nor the St. Croix or Cobscook region. And so we're right now figuring out how do we continue this conversation, either virtually under the pandemic conditions, or in the future in a more in-person way. As you can imagine, much of our work with fishermen, it's really much better to have folks in a room feeding off of one another's ideas and creativity, and we get a whole lot of valuable information and insight that way. Can we replicate that kind of a setting in Zoom? I don't know, but we're willing to try. This is what one of those meetings looked like. This is from the Trenton meeting, which was just phenomenal. And essentially, we set the room up into 3 different tables and break the groups, the whole audience breaks into these 3 groups and ask these 3 questions. And so here's Carla, Dr. Gunther, facilitating a discussion and writing down on these butcher paper. In this case, I think she's asking the second question: what's important for you and your community as things change? And we get this really rich dialogue going, and everybody feeds onto those papers for 20 minutes. And then we shift and we dance over to another table where you might be asking, what is changing in policy and rules? And then 20 minutes later, go to another table and you see, and you ask them the question, what's changing around us economically, socially, and biologically? For that Trenton meeting, we had a pretty good representation. These things are always uneven, as you all probably know, but we had harvesters, we had some folks from the university, some folks working in the river herring fisheries, some federal partners from both the National Park Service and NOAA. And we had a participant from Bar Harbor area and environmental and advocacy work with tourism, as well as some shellfish managers and the land trust. So it's a nice cross section, and it would be ideal, as we continue this conversation, to be able to get that kind of participation. The comments that come in are all over the place, and right now we're sorting them out and trying to make sure we're learning what we can and use some of this to continue to leverage these conversations. But just a few of the comments, it comes back to community. We need more capacity for research because you can't manage well if you don't have the information. Co-management needs to avoid top-down and have shared responsibility. Regulations need to allow for more jobs, careers in rural towns to recruit and retain young people. No more muscle seed is here. Educate and develop workforce skills for what is needed in these communities. And access for Maine fishermen into marine fisheries is important. So you can see that I was cherry picking across the notes, obviously, but trying to show you that the interests here don't always just be about fish. They're not just about counting fish and the natural science, but clearly the people that came to these meetings are concerned about their communities. They're concerned about their people, their families, their businesses, and the prosperity of the region. So we're synthesizing these notes from the conference, and I'm getting help from Bob Wood. I want to thank Bob. He's director of what's called the Down East Fisheries Partnership. And we're binning these notes into these kinds of areas right now. And we suspect we'll be publishing a paper to highlight where we are in this conversation. And then, of course, this can inform future conversations as we blend this into a science conversation to help get us towards that research agenda. So I'm going to stop there. It's 12:47. I did okay. That's my contact information. This will be listed up again at the end of the conference. But if you want to write down how you can reach out to us, that's how you can find me. And I will stop sharing there, Pat. And again, we're going to now Carl's going to present some small slide deck, and then John will do his. And I hope we're going to end up with some time at the end for some Q&A. So, Carl, do you have permission to share?
I did before everyone came on, so let's see if I can do this now.
And while Carl is teeing up his presentation, I'll just remind everybody to, as you think of questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. You don't have to wait until the end. go ahead and type them into the Q&A box, and I'll be monitoring the chat and Q&A throughout the presentations, and we'll circle back to them at the end.
So, Pat, you might need to help me here. I'm seeing a little bit different folder view than I have before. Let's just see if, oh, here we go. I think we'll be in good shape here. Pat, can you see my presentation now?
Yep, looks good. Go ahead.
Okay.
It's about aquatic resource education. Is that what you wanted to present?
That is not what I wanted to put forward. Let's go back to Zoom.
A topic for another day, maybe.
Let's see.
So when you click on share screen, you probably have a few different options on what to share.
Here we go.
Now,
now you see a PowerPoint. Okay, well, that's good. Well, welcome everybody. Again, Carl Wilson with the Maine Department of Marine Resources. I wanted to start with just a little bit more of a personal reflection around why this conversation interests me. And this is a picture that I shared with the group back in 2019. When we were in Machias and talking about Eastern Maine Coastal Current Collaborative. This is a picture of Head Harbor down on Isle of Ho, where I was lucky enough to spend all my summers as a kid growing up. And it was found up in the attic in one of the houses, and it's probably from between 1915 and 1920. And I think at one point I counted 13 different masts out there. And what these sailboats were doing, you can see that the sailboats, and then it looks like there's a few dories and small open boats kind of further into the harbor here. But from what I understand, these boats with the masts are day boats that would come out to Isle of Ho and spend the summer accessing the local fishing grounds. These were all groundfish boats going after hake and cod and pollock. And on the right-hand side of the picture, there was actually a small community of fishing shacks that these guys would live in over the course of the summer. And you can still go there in the spring and find kind of new relics that have kind of exploded up from the ground in the spring. And you'll find Edison electric batteries. You'll find old paint cans and paint brushes for coppering the bottom. The rocks have tar on them from when they would tar their nets, and I also found a couple oarlocks for sculling these boats when the wind died, and I'm just struck by how much things have changed. I've been with the department for 20 years. When I was going through undergraduate and kind of getting interested in marine science and fisheries, what I saw every summer that I went back to the island was this really rapid decline in the inshore ground fishery, where when I was a kid, you could see the boats steaming in every afternoon in the Stonington, and there was, I think, 30 or 40 gillnet boats that used to go out of, and several draggers that used to go out of Stonington. And now I don't believe there is one out of Stonington. And that's in my lifetime, which is not short anymore. It's getting a little bit longer. But it's still in a relatively short amount of time. And just kind of the perspective looking forward here, in the next 20 years, from what I understand about the climate change scenarios, in the best case, as far as climate change, we're going to see the same kind of temperature increases that we've seen over the last 20 years in the next 20 years, under the best case scenarios. In that time, we've seen a blinking out of our ground fishery along the coast of Maine. We've seen dramatic declines in our sea urchin fishery. We've seen dramatic increases in our lobster fishery. Major fundamental changes in what makes up, the fishing industry along the coast of Maine. And so I think it's really important. And when I'm talking to staff that are just kind of coming on into our department, some of these changes, we just don't know, but they're going to be coming within, the the careers of, say, half the people within the department right now are going to see a very different coast of Maine than what we're seeing right now. And I think that's really, just for me, it adds a little perspective in that things are changing quickly, and we need to understand that. So while today this picture of Head Harbor looks very different, and just to kind of advance a little bit, this is a picture of commercial multi-species groundfish activity available on the NROC mapping site. And really Eastern Maine here is, if you can see my cursor here, in this kind of Eastern Maine Coastal Collaborative is almost devoid of groundfish activity. So in 100 years, we've gone from, a dozen day boats in a small harbor to almost no activity at all within 30 miles of Stonington and Idaho. And I think these are, again, illustrated of the changes. This is just kind of a composite map of vessel monitoring systems that are pinging away as a groundfish boat is going out and doing their thing along the coast. For me, again, the interest that the department has right now is trying to develop the science that's going to support a new way of thinking, whether it be, call it ecosystem-based management or call it whatever you want. But it's the idea is that we are trying to integrate and provide data that allows a little bit better integration across multiple resources, multiple taxa, and really consideration of the physical and the biological environment as well. So Eastern Maine, this was a slide again I gave in Machias a year ago. So this is landings value and weight of commercial fisheries for Washington and Hancock County. Absolutely dominated by lobster, no question about it. Nearly 100 million pounds in lobsters in 2018, valued at over $370 million. This represents 88% of the value of the fisheries in Eastern Maine. And Eastern Maine is actually where some of our most diverse fisheries are for Maine. This is a good picture relative to the rest of the coast. And you can see that there's a long list of species that are still sold along the coast or still landed on the coast. And yes, they are, compared to lobsters, they're relatively small volume and small value, but they're still an interested in diverse set of fisheries here. The column on the furthest to the right is the just a real kind of qualitative look of how is the science that can support these resources there. And I tried to represent, yes, we have good surveys for those resources in green. We kind of hit or miss in the resources in yellow, and we have no surveys for the resources that capture the resources that are in red. And so from my perspective as kind of leading our marine science group at the department is we have a long way to go, and there's plenty of gaps in information in just our coastal fisheries and resources it is. So there's a real an opportunity here to start to fill in those red holes of our knowledge of what the resource is going. And it doesn't necessarily have to be kind of traditional fisheries surveys or monitoring programs. This is kind of the real opportunity with conversations like Paul was introducing, is that there's an opportunity to learn from the communities and learn from the people that are using these resources and benefiting from them as a way to help us inform our conversations going forward in the future. One thing that I think John will talk about is NOAA and the Science Center has really been doing an interesting job where they've been providing kind of updates on the ecosystem status on an annual basis. And in the Gulf of Maine, we took our inshore trawl survey and kind of applied some of the status indicators for Eastern Maine relative to the resource that we, kind of grouping of resources. And really the only thing that's kind of looks to be in the positive would be the slide with benthivores. These are lobsters crabs and some haddock, yellowtail, etc. And along the coast of Maine, this is what's doing well right now, is largely the invertebrates. And we've got definite changes in other parts of the ecosystem. And so how these all connect together, I'm hoping that over the next 5 years to a couple decades, still, I think we're going to need to make those linkages going forward. And how they interact with the environment contributes to this next slide that I'm showing, in that we have, even in some of our coastal areas that have had fishing activity for over 100 years, we still have a dearth of knowledge, basic knowledge of what the bottom looks like, what the environment that these guys are working in. This slide here is an example. It's a screenshot from it's a navigation program called OLEX, and it essentially allows you to build your own bathymetric maps as you move around. We took this program and kind of souped it up a little bit and hooked up a multi-beam sonar. And so instead of the boat going along and creating one ping of bathymetry as it goes along, it created a swath of 120 pings. And so over time, you can build up this really complex bathymetric map. And this is an example of a fisherman who attended the conference in Machias, 2 years of his fishing activity in the area that he fishes out of Millbridge. And I think even before you concentrate on the colors of where he was fishing, if you look at the underlying chart that is shown here, these are the soundings that are available in this area. And there are points where you can actually look at the lead line sail that the hydrographic vessel did 100 years ago. I mean, these are old soundings that we're using. And then as your eye starts to shift to the areas that he was fishing, you start to see this incredibly complex bottom that is kind of revealed out of what is relatively blank space. It says mud. That's really an informative area. But if you go into the actual bottom of what's out there, you see this incredibly complex area. This is what fishermen have been fishing and learning in their heads for over 100 years. And really, when working with this fisherman, Michael Sargent, and before that, his father, Cappy Sargent, when I first talked with Cappy Sargent, 25 years ago now, he drew this map for me in his head. He had spent 20 years gill netting in this area, and he literally rolled his head into the back of his head and drew out in his mind what this bottom looked like. And so this was one of the real reasons why, when this technology became available, I was like, I would really like to get this on his boat. And this is a life's work here contained within this map. And again, this is just a blown up area. This is a 1 nautical mile chunk of the bottom, somewhere to the west of Schoodic Ridges. And it just shows the diversity. Red is really steep, hard bottom areas. Green and yellow is a transition to soft bottom and mud. And blue and purple would be kind of your fine particulates. All of this kind of granularity of information is hard to incorporate into how we do our fisheries science, how we do our fisheries management, but it's important. And this is how people, when you're actually going after these resources, this kind of information is very important. And so I'm hopeful that this kind of knowledge base is something that's going to be tapped as we go forward in our conversations. And really interestingly, in the last year, NOAA has started to collate kind of non-traditional mapping products, and that they have actually accepted this data. So this is non-hydrographic quality bathymetric data. Works pretty darn well for fishing, but it doesn't meet the extensive guidelines for hydrographic surveys. They've accepted this data and have incorporated this and a few other fishermen's data into a composite bathymetric map for the Gulf of Maine. that's going to be being published very soon. I think that we've seen some preliminary data, but it's going to be a 4-meter resolution, so less than 12 feet resolution for bottom depth for the entire Gulf of Maine. It's just amazing that this has actually been incorporated, and really, I think a big jump forward for how we might be able to look at things in the future. And again, bathymetry, bottom depth is kind of one of those fundamental underpinnings of information that when we look at problems, what's going on out there? What does the bottom look like? So I'm going to press pause here, Paul, and pass it on to John. Didn't want to go too deep into things, but hopefully this will spur a little bit of questions.
Thank you very much, Carl. Thank you, Paul. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Are we sharing or no?
It is sharing. Yep, I see your slide deck, and if you hit present, we should be able to see your slide a little bit larger.
Okay. Thank you, Pat. Yeah, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about ecosystem-based fisheries management, and I'm excited about the Eastern Maine Coastal Current because of the science that Paul and Carl described, but also because of the interactions that Paul and Carl described. And so it's similar to, Carl, I'm going to give a little bit of a personal journey. And my thoughts on ecosystem-based fisheries management have really been shaped by sort of work and colleagues in Maine. I don't live in Maine, but we've been involved in the Eastern Maine Coastal Current Collaborative for a while. I've attended the Maine Fishermen's Forum every year since I've been Science Center director, and we do a lot of work with Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, Maine Department of Marine Resources, and Maine Sea Grant. And so, my thinking about EBFM has changed over time. I'm going to talk a little bit about those changes. And if you're interested in more detail, I wrote a sort of food for thought perspective on these changes in my sort of approach and thoughts about science. If you're interested, there's the reference for this. An open access publication. It's more of an essay style. So I'm director of the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, and our mission is to conduct ecosystem-based research and assessments of living marine resources to promote the recovery and long-term sustainability of these resources, and to generate social and economic opportunities and benefits from their use. And those are, there's a lot of words there, but it's, basically we manage and work with fisheries and wildlife. Our goal is to promote their recovery, provide for their long-term sustainability, to generate social and economic opportunities and benefits for the nation. So it's a big, complex problem. We're working in this what's called complex socio-ecological system. As a scientist, I realized my approach, and I think the approach of many scientists of many scientific institutions to questions like this is really founded in sort of the public policy framework called the rational comprehensive approach. And it's basically institutions and trained professionals oversee and conduct the required comprehensive planning and decision making. So, you have a problem, you give it to scientists, scientists come up with a solution and provide it back to the people asking for a solution. And sort of in the fisheries management world, it's just conceptually in this diagram here, managers, which is made up of basically a large number of participants in fisheries, managers, decision makers, fishers, processors, NGOs, federal, state, local, tribal representatives, enforcement scientists. And then the scientists are sort of given these problems to solve and then give the answer back. And that really is rooted in our culture that was founded in this rational comprehensive approach, which goes back in public policies into the early 50s. But when I look at my job, fisheries, protected species, wind energy, aquaculture, it's hard to sort of clarify where one problem starts and the other problem ends. And that really comes down to this, what's called wicked problems. It sort of started me on this journey of like learning more about the culture, that rational, comprehensive approach culture that I grew up in, and realizing that there are other ways to think about how to address problems. And this wicked problem was really my entree. And wicked problems are difficult or impossible to solve because of incomplete, contradictory, ill-defined, and changing requirements. And when I read that definition, I was like, well, that's my job. It's not like I can just carve out one piece of this and solve the problem and give the answer back. And so, the other approach, which is sort of in comparison to the rational, comprehensive approach, which much of how we think about problem solving is rooted in this country, is something called an incremental approach. And it recognizes that many problems are too complex for full understanding and do not allow for clearly defined steps and comprehensive decision making to develop and implement solutions. And so in working with Paul and working with Carl and working with the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries and working with Maine Department of Marine Resources, I also grew an appreciation that these problems that we're working on can't simply be solved by scientists and then given back as an answer. They need to be worked on over time by a group of people. And just to sort of lay out, with wicked problem, it's a Gordian knot. But there's these components to a problem which are, summarized in this figure. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about a couple of them. So that Gordian knot is that cloud of the problem field. And each stakeholder, be a scientist, be an NGO, be a fisherman, be a conservationist, is looking at the problem from different perspectives. And the more different those perspectives are, the more complex the solution to that problem is going to be, because you have these different stakeholders. And if they just see the problem completely differently, it's going to be very hard for them to work on it together. So a lot of what we need to be working on when we're working on problems is thinking about what is this distance among stakeholders and how do we bring perspectives closer together. Another element is this, what's down here at the bottom, called path dependency. Any problem that you're trying to solve now is going to carry with it all the previous attempts to solve that problem in the past. And so you need to understand the history of a problem and the history of the solutions to a problem to make progress on it into the future. And so, coming through this sort of learning process, reading about the rational, comprehensive approach, reading about this incremental approach to wicked problems, in that essay, I sort of wrote down 10 lessons for myself. And one is to accept that fisheries are a complex socio-ecological system, and acknowledge that humans are very much part of the ecosystem. Can't separate the human element from the natural resource element. They are intimately combined. Second lesson was I need to work to strengthen existing adaptive management processes. And if you look at U.S. Federal Fisheries Management, Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Management Act, our fisheries management councils, those are adaptive structures. They were designed around sort of iterating on a problem continually. So really need to continue to strengthen these adaptive management processes. We need to encourage and engage in participatory science, and that is in part to help stakeholders grow, to decrease the distance between perspectives, have different groups working on a problem together. That really is one way which has been shown to really come to a more common perspective of a given problem set. Question inertia. Inertia is a fancy word for the past. You need to understand the past, but you can't be stuck in the past. So you can't let sort of past attempts to solve a problem keep you from trying to solve a problem anew. And then, this is really, for me, one of the key lessons, and we need to respect all perspectives. There's not one perspective which has more value than another perspective. Every perspective needs to be respected in this sort of incremental problem solving. We also need to recognize fishers as knowledge experts. I think Carl's example was an excellent one. The fisherman that he described was able to draw a map of the bottom that he had been fishing for decades without ever seeing the bottom. And so there's a lot of expertise, a lot of knowledge about marine ecosystems, about these complex systems that fishers have, and we need to respect that. We need to consider the scale of the problem. Eastern Current and Gulf of Maine is a particular scale. It's within the larger Gulf of Maine, but it's also got Penobscot Bay and Machias Bay. And so there's different scales to our problem. And we need to be open to changing your mind and adjusting your perspective. We're trying to be evidence-based and let evidence and science drive how we think about things. And a key piece of that is that you need to be willing to change your mind and change your perspective. And then these last two are sort of more on the sciencey side of things. You need to keep reading and listening and discussing broadly, and that's why I'm here today, just to have a conversation. And we need to keep publishing and communicating the results of what we're doing, our science and management flag posts. We need to keep planting flags so others can follow, and that's an important piece of this. And these ideas were new to me, but they are no way new. And I think Eleanor Ostrom, she was sort of a real proponent for thinking about these complex problems, these complex systems, using sort of this approach which I outlined here. And so, I'm not saying that this is like a revelation, but it was a revealing experience for me to think about ecosystem-based fisheries management from an incremental approach. And that, brings me back to sort of the Northeast Fisheries Science Center mission. This is not a problem set that that NOAA or the Science Center can take and solve and provide an answer back. This idea of ecosystem-based research and assessments of living marine resources is something that we need to work on together. And that is why we're excited to be part of the Eastern Maine Coastal Current Collaborative, because it really forms this idea that by working together with the state, with Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, with the stakeholders and groups that the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries can bring to the table, we can better define our problems, understand each other's perspectives, have an opportunity to bring our perspectives into better alignment, understand sort of the history of our problems, and come up with solutions that we want to carry forward together. And it's a fundamentally different approach than how traditionally scientists, traditionally how we think about problem solving, because much of our science is really rooted in that sort of rational, comprehensive approach. So here are the links from sort of the paper, the essay that I wrote. Carl mentioned our ecosystem status reports. I didn't talk about those, but the link is there. We produce a status report for the New England Fisheries Management Council and one for the Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council, where there's a lot of information there. And I look forward to having an opportunity to sort of answer questions and have a discussion. So thank you, Paul, for the opportunity.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Thank you, Carl. That was all very provocative stuff. I know I enjoyed the essay when it got published, John, and I sent it out to a lot of folks, friends and colleagues. Okay, Pat, I'm going to put up our final closing slide, but if you want to queue up some questions.
Sure. Yep. We've got about 15 minutes here. Thanks for staying on time, all three of you. That was I was in a meeting yesterday where nothing went on time. So, okay, I'm going to jump right into it here. There was a couple of questions in the Q&A that were already answered in text. I think everybody can see that. Just in case you can't, I'll tick down through them. An anonymous attendee asked, at the Trenton meeting, what was the breakdown of fisheries participants? I was at that meeting. There were about 19 or 20 total participants in that one, and 7 of them were harvesters, representing aquaculture, river herring, shellfish, lobsters, elvers, groundfish, scallops, a lot of different fisheries. And then related to that, there was a question about the differences in how the Washington County community saw the questions as opposed to the Trenton participants. I was at both of those meetings as well, and Paul, you can jump in here too. I think you were at both of them. These meetings are very much, the perspectives that are offered are very much driven by obviously the people who show up. Down in Millbridge, we had a lot of upland participants, and I think we had a couple of blueberry factory owners. We had some tourism industry people. We had some small businesses in town, as opposed to the Trenton meeting where we had a lot of harvesters and aquaculture folks. And so the perspectives that we gained just from those two meetings, we reached all the way from very far inland in the tourism industry and and then very far offshore, talking about ground fishing in days past. So, Paul, do you want to offer a little bit more perspective on those watershed meetings that we had?
Yeah, well, you touched on it, Pat. Anybody knows if you organize these things, it depends on who shows up is what you end up getting. And for Millbridge, we had a few fishermen queued up. In fact, the one who Carl showed you that data for was coming, but ended up his schedule had gotten changed because of a fishing trip or something and was unable to be there. So that night, the complexion of the conversation went towards who was in the room, and we learned a lot about upland activity with the blueberry industry in that area. And I think that probably would happen for anybody hosting these kinds of evening meetings where you want to get some of the right people. We didn't broadcast them a lot because we didn't want 100 people in the room. We wanted a good group of people that we could work with. So there's kind of careful what you wish for and then see what you get.
Let's see here. A couple of open questions that haven't been answered yet. Interesting that both groups attracted the same number of attendees. I was curious to learn if the community saw change differently. Yeah, I think that relates to sort of the answers that we just provided. Based on the differences in attendees that we got, I think everybody saw it change a little bit differently. There was a lot of discussion in Millbridge about sort of technology and workforce, and we talked a lot about changes that are needed in technology and workforce down in Millbridge. I'm gonna jump to the next one, unless somebody else wants to pick that up.
There's a few here from Tom for John and Carl.
Yep, go ahead if you see a good one.
So yeah, where in the framing does nature sit? What voice speaks for the ecosystem? I think there's I would answer that in two different ways. Every group involved here that we're talking about has a different sort of perspective of the ecosystem, and so everyone, the ecosystem speaks through each stakeholder differently. There are groups whose objectives are to speak for the ecosystem. I think of many non-governmental organizations, conservation organizations. And the other way to think about it too is that whatever we're doing, we are doing within sort of a set of laws that we have. And we have the Endangered Species Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. So there are, we have rules and regulations and laws that we need to follow as we think about how we're going to address a problem. So I think, the ecosystem that's how I would answer that sort of ecosystem question. Does the wicked problem approach lend itself to an overly reductionist viewpoint? I think you can answer, I think anything can lead us to an overly reductionist viewpoint. And I think we need to be cognizant of trying not to get too overly reductionist. I think the wicked problem, it identifies two pitfalls. One is that the problem is so complicated that it's just too hard to even work on. So we'll just keep doing what we're doing. And the other pitfall sort of along this point of view is that, well, there's got to be one solution to this problem, and all we need to do is work hard enough to find it. And I think the concept of the wicked problem is that it's the group of organizations, group of individuals getting together and working on the problem that the solution then emerges from, as opposed to one group finding a solution and presenting it. So I hope that helps answer some of your questions, Tom.
Thanks, John. Carl, there's a question here about research priorities that have been developed for sort of the top species in the list that you showed on that slide. So lobsters, clams, scallops, et cetera.
Yeah, so in 2018, we went through a series of 6 research priority setting meetings for, I think, 8 different species along the coast. And looking at this, so those are available. We're going to be getting them up I don't know why they're not on our website yet, but they are not, but they're available. And we, in the past, we've used these kind of priorities as a way to work with partners and prioritize what research we're doing, but also prioritize what research we're kind of collaborating with partners. What's really interesting in the context of this conversation is we kind of missed the opportunity on those research setting meetings in that it was a very single species approach to thinking about research priorities. And I think that's, you know, as I was reading your question, you know, kind of a really remiss to think about how the next time the department goes through a research priority setting session is how we might be able to fold in some of these ecosystem-based conversations at the same time. Because, you know, I think if you only consider lobster for your management decisions, then that might be exactly what we need to do for that particular question at that particular time, but you might be missing the broader context of what else is going on, or that could be said for scallops or urchins or periwinkles or whatever. So thank you. Pat, I think you might be muted.
I'm unmuted now. Ken, I'm going to allow you to talk. Let's see if we can get this to work. Ken Crowell, go ahead.
It's actually going to be Marnie, I think.
Oh, hi, Marnie.
Ken is standing right here, but
It's her question.
I'm particularly interested in the fact that we've been going to the bar at Bard Island for over 50 years. And so it's the same observers observing the same habitat with no particular reason to think that there have been major changes around us out in the bay. And so I've observed the shells that wash up on that same stretch. And over the 50 years we've been watching, things like moon snails used to make sand collar nests there. Haven't seen a shell for years. I used to collect gouldi, I can't say the name, another shell, but I used to get one or two every day, and I don't see any at all. And none of the species are things that people, the humans, eat. So nobody, I can't find any data. I can't find anybody who wants the data. But we're both in our 80s, and it would be, seems to me that even though they're just not quantitative data in the sense that we usually do with science, it would give somebody some clues to look for things that are a little more subtle than saying, oh, the barnacles have disappeared on the rock faces. It's not that. Some are their habitats are deep water. At least one of them is a mud species. So they're different species in different habitats. And we know that my husband's an ecologist, and we know that they play some part, but there's not a clue to tell somebody that you might want to be looking. And so I want to tell somebody that probably we're not the only people who have observations over years that are purely subjective, but they give you clues for where to look. And since this is such a complex thing we're up against, it seems to me we need all the clues we can get.
Yeah, Marnie, thank you. And that's a great example of some of the observations that that we heard in the watershed meetings that we had down the coast. You know, people would come with these observations of, you know, I've been looking at this same piece of dirt for 30 years, and these are the observations that I've witnessed. And some of the beauty of that is some of those can turn into research priorities later on, if they're deemed, you know, important enough to keep track of. All of them are important enough to keep track of. But I'll let one of these guys respond to that too.
I would just say those are wonderful observations, and I think we often lose that kind of classical naturalist observations when we get buried in fishery science and management questions. Is you know, we fail to look up from the trees and see the forest. And I think that's I was a trained marine ecologist in graduate school, and some of my best experiences ever underwater when I was doing my thesis research is when I actually just stopped doing what I was doing and just let my eyes wander for a few minutes and just kind of sat there and observed. And there are so many times that I've wanted to have said, God, I wish I had just written that down, because I'd be able to go back to that spot and see if that is still there. So in my mind, I mean, I hear the question all the time, what have happened to all the mussels? And these are this like really good anecdotal conversations that actually contribute to the larger conversations and do integrate in with a more traditional fishery science. So I would say keep spreading the word, keep spreading your observations, and everyone take time to look what's around and how things have changed. So.
Pat, the only thing I'll add, this is Paul and Marty, I agree with what Carl just shared. One of the aspirations we had around this EM3C initiative is that it would become a network and an opportunity for people, traditional scientists, policymakers, and citizens alike who care and who are paying attention and come to the network and take away what you need, bring what you can, and probably we can cultivate, I hope, other partnerships and other interests. There are other institutions along Maine's coast who are doing more naturalist and conservation style biology. And, I hope that they and their scientists and institutions and their stakeholders come to the party, and that we have a network to help curate and try to help connect people. Yes, most of the emphasis on, federally funded science and so forth is about those critters that we're harvesting and trying to sustain harvests. But there's a whole lot of other measures of ecosystem health that we ought to be looking at. And those kinds of observations that you just shared, I think, fit in the conversation.
All right, Paul, we're right at 1:30. I know there are a few more questions, but I just wanted to remind everyone that the folks who are on the panel here, consider yourselves introduced to them, and feel free to reach out to them directly. And they've got your questions here in front of them, and they can go ahead and answer them on the screen. But Paul, if you want to give us a sign off, we can let folks go.
Okay, I'll remind you folks that we do record these. They get packaged a little bit by our video media specialist, and then they will be posted on the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries website. We have a rapidly growing video page that has our lunch and learns from this summer. This is the last of the 5 for this season, although given how successful they've been, we will probably consider doing 1 or 2 in the wintertime to keep you engaged and informed on things. So please stay tuned to what we're up to. And thank you so much for joining us. I'm sorry if we didn't get to everybody's questions, but I want to thank Carl and John for spending time with us. That was very provocative, and I appreciate Pat's help behind the scenes. Stay in touch, be safe, look out for one another, and be sure to vote next week.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks, guys. Pat, thanks for hosting.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Carl.